Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed lunch. We'll move on to our next portion of the day, which is the Ralph Slatyer address. And I'd like to welcome back Dr. Kathy Foley to the stage. Please welcome her with me.
So it's wonderful to get a round of applause for introducing someone. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming back and sitting down after scrumptious sandwiches and coffee. This is a great honour to be invited just to do the introduction to the Ralph Slatyer annual oration, I guess it is, because Ralph Slatyer, of course, was Australia's first chief scientist from 1989 to 1992 and has left the most amazing legacy. It's something which I can only dream that I might be able to do such a thing, but who knows. But the thing that's also amazing is that his family are here today as well. So I want to welcome June Slatyer, who is Ralph's wife, or widow, I guess, and Tony Slatyer, his son. Judy and Beth send their apologies, they're Ralph's daughters. And also welcome Malcolm Elford, who is June's partner. So let's give a round of applause to say welcome. It's great to show the enthusiasm. And that's because it is an important legacy. The CRC program is something that's been enduring. It's something that has really made Australia have a particular approach to things, which has kept on and evolved over time. And so it's really appropriate that Catherine Livingstone is our Ralph Slatyer speaker today. And the reason why, I'm not going to go through all her credentials again because you've heard it twice already, but I do want to point out that she is someone who really has made a big impact on me, and I know on the research community and on industry across Australia. When she was the chair of CSIRO, I was in CSIRO at that time, and I think her chair role there really helped to make a CSIRO shift towards a real industry focus and that whole of systems approach in the thinking. And I can still remember some of her speeches, which were recorded and played on almost continuous reel, like the programs that have been up on these big screens today. It's just reminding us about how tricky it is to bring research, bring industry together and government, but how critical it is for the country. So she's going to be coming out and speaking to us now, and I'd like to invite her to the stage. So please give her a warm welcome. Over to you, Catherine.
Well, thank you very much, Kathy, for that introduction. And it's a bit frightening to think of speeches being on continuous reel, but I really, really enjoyed my time at CSIRO. It's a terrific organisation. But can I acknowledge the Slatyer family and just say how honoured I am to be asked to give this address and to remind us all of Ralph's extraordinary legacy in both science and innovation. And I make that distinction quite deliberately. If we go to the science side, Ralph's most influential scientific research was in environmental plant physiology, as he explored the way plants responded to the soil-plant-atmosphere continuum. And this recognition of interdependence led to the concept of an ecosystem, a term which we use all too freely, I think, nowadays, but without perhaps pausing to consider its true nature and the extent of that interdependence. Importantly, though, he also demonstrated the fragility of natural ecosystems in the face of disturbance, which is something I'll come back to. But leaving aside the science, then Ralph took all of that knowledge and that understanding and the inherent independence in ecosystems, and he applied it to our innovation system, or what we now call our innovation system. I don't think we really used the word innovation too much at that time. But in doing that, in 1990, as chief scientist, and as Kathy said, he was the first chief scientist, he designed, developed, and implemented the Cooperative Research Centre, the CRC program. And his purpose was to address the deficiencies that he saw in Australia's science and technology system by enabling better critical mass in those key research areas and also facilitating linkages between researchers and users of the research. So again, he knew that people were at the centre of innovation. And Ralph was said to be a man of wisdom and tranquil force. So I'm sure that the family might want to endorse that. Now, the Slatyer family has asked me to showcase this legacy through the Cochlear story and the lessons we can learn from it. And I'm only too delighted at any time to talk about the Cochlear story and why Cochlear was successful. So I'll recap on the story. I'll talk then about the lessons for innovation policy that come from that experience, and I'll finish by highlighting 3 challenges that I think Australia must address if we're going to have enduring benefit from our innovation system. So the Cochlear story. So how often have I heard the question, why doesn't Australia have more success stories like Cochlear? But to answer this question, it's really important to understand the factors which set Cochlear on its path to success. And there are 3 parts to this story. The first part is the scientific research. And the story started with Graham Clark, who became interested in hearing and brain research in the mid-1960s after qualifying as an ENT surgeon. Clark's main research began at Melbourne University in 1969. He faced ongoing significant challenges raising money for the research. In fact, he had to resort to a telethon at one point to get ongoing funding. But fortunately, with perseverance, the research project managed to survive, and the first prototype human implant occurred in 1978. So from 1969 to 1978, before there was the first prototype implant. This was breakthrough science, and I think the Minister mentioned it this morning. It was multi-channel stimulation, putting an electrode in the inner ear. Now, at that point, ENT surgeons were taught, do not go near the inner ear. Do not approach. And certainly don't stick a wire in the inner ear. And yet, this is exactly what happened. The lead goes into the inner ear, and the multi-channel technology meant that there was stimulation again on multiple points on the hearing nerve, which is why the cochlear implant that Cochlear developed was so successful. The device became known as the bionic ear, and as I said, the multi-channel technology was a world first. However, by 1979, the number of researchers on the project had been severely reduced, and the project funding was exhausted. So notwithstanding Professor Clark's passion and achievements, no further university funding was available, and the project was to be discontinued. That's part 1 of the story, the science. Part 2 is the government. So in parallel to all of the scientific events, there were developments on the government side. In 1976, Ian McPhee was sworn in as Minister of Productivity and relentlessly argued, what we're doing today, for the creation of new industries in Australia, and including for a biotechnology sector. He established the concept of a public interest grant with the objective of improving national competitiveness by encouraging projects which would lead to new products, new processes, new businesses, and new sectors. The grant program sought to enable the R&D investment required to take an invention through translation to commercialisation, and in those instances where, without government support, that commercialisation would be unlikely to occur. McPhee enlisted the help of Ralph Tobias, who was then First Assistant Secretary in the Department of Productivity and Science and Technology. And he headed a task force to go and find appropriate projects. And Tobias already had a passion for developing Australian business and national capability. So through a series of events, they tracked down the Bionic Ear project, and Tobias was determined that this opportunity would not be lost to Australia. So in 1979, and remembering this at this time, 1979 is when the University of Melbourne had run out of money for the Cochlear research project, but in 1979, McPhee approved an initial grant of $400,000, a lot of money in that time, to undertake a global market survey and product development plan for the bionic ear project. Tenders were called, and Nucleus Limited was chosen because of its experience in the development and commercialisation of implantable cardiac pacemakers through its Telectronics division. In total, 4 rounds of government funding, coming to $4.7 million, took place between 1979 and 1985, with each funding round tied to the achievement of milestones. A further condition of the public interest grant was that Cochlear maintain its manufacturing in Australia. There was a licensing agreement between Nucleus University and the government, with the latter two licensors having a joint share of royalties at a rate of 5% of sales on the first 12,000 units and 2% thereafter. And 12,000 units was clearly seen as a very ambitious target at that point. So that's the government. The third part of the story is the industry partner, Nucleus Limited, and I was at this time working in Nucleus. Paul Traynor founded Nucleus in 1965 with a vision for a medical technology sector in Australia. He wasn't a scientist, he wasn't a technologist, he just had a vision. And he brought this vision to life through Nucleus, which had several divisions. At the time, they included Telectronics, which was the major division, which, again, at that time, was a world leader in implantable pacemakers and was also developing the implantable defibrillator. It had the Aursonics division, which was ultrasound, and Aursonics developed the world's first portable ultrasound machine. So it was an incredible company. Nucleus won the public interest grant tender for the Cochlear project in mid-1979 and carried out the market survey and costed the product development for a cochlear implant. And on the basis of that, government agreed to fund the next stage of the project. Phase 2 grant of $1.5 million was made in 1980, and that provided funding back to the university to continue the research project, and also for Nucleus to translate the research through design and development of a clinical prototype ready for further human trials. At this point, Nucleus estimated that it would take a further 10 years from the first prototype to a fully FDA-approved medical device. Following the successful outcome of Phase 2, and I recall vividly that these milestones were very clear to the whole organisation, because if that milestone wasn't met, there'd be no further grant funding under public interest grant, and to say that Nucleus had no cash was putting it mildly. My job as a sort of junior finance person was actually to find the money every 2 weeks to meet the fortnightly payroll. That's how close to the wind we were actually sailing. So those milestones of getting that money for the grant for Cochlear was really the lifeline. So Phase 2 was successful. Phase 3, another grant of $2.3 million, was late 1982, under which Nucleus committed to delivering a prosthesis which was ready for full clinical trials. And at that point, Nucleus was to contribute 25% of that phase, and the government covered 75%. And then there was a final phase, smaller Phase 4 grant in 85, and at that point, Nucleus assumed full responsibility for the commercialisation of the cochlear implant. But it's important to know that even from that point, it was several years before the cochlear business was even cash flow break-even, let alone profit break-even. And it was the other divisions in Nucleus which were actually supporting the cochlear division. But by 1988, Paul Traynor, as the majority shareholder in Nucleus, just did not have the financial resources, and he was the majority shareholder, and without him putting in more capital, then he was going to lose control of the company. He couldn't fund the company's growth, particularly because of the cochlear division, but he was determined that it would remain in Australian hands. And so he negotiated with Pacific Dunlop, no longer an Australian company, but at that point it was a major Australian company, and he negotiated with them to make a takeover bid for Nucleus, which it did in July 1988. In 1992, as a division of Pacific Dunlop, Cochlear became a participant in one of the first CRCs, the CRC for Implant, Speech and Hearing Research, which ran from 92 to 99, and it was a member in the follow-on 2 CRCs over a total of 28 years. In 1995, Cochlear was spun out of Pacific Dunlop via an IPO valued at $150 million. It remains listed in Australia, is currently worth over $17 billion, offices in 30 countries and sales in 180. And while it manufactures in several locations globally, it does maintain a manufacturing presence in Australia, in keeping with the condition of the original public interest grant. And finally, the royalty return to government has far exceeded the amount of the public interest grant. Just a couple of other observations to sort of round out the story. Certainly, having lived through the day-to-day of the events I've just described, I can certainly attest that the reality was much more turbulent, with many twists and turns, disappointments, and serendipitous successes. Cochlear was the 1 in 10 survivor from the nuclear stable of companies. The reasons for the demise of the others are chapters in themselves. Suffice it to say, the people in Cochlear, many of whom were formerly in telectronics or sonics within Nucleus, were able to leverage the technology in and the harsh business lessons learnt by being part of the Nucleus group. The diaspora of people who started their careers in the Nucleus group can be found in companies throughout the medical technology sector in Australia. So Paul's vision for that sector has certainly been realised. One of the environmental, or can I say innovation system factors working in Cochlear's favour was that Australia was a global hearing healthcare centre of excellence in the world, and there are 4, and Australia was 1. And it had institutions such as Australian Hearing Services and the National Acoustics Lab. These, in turn, arose from the actions of far-sighted bureaucrats after World War I, who recognised the need for hearing healthcare infrastructure for the many returned soldiers who returned and had suffered debilitating hearing loss as a result of their time in the trenches in France. Cochlear was therefore able to draw on the heritage of many well-trained and experienced audiologists who play an essential part in the programming of the speech processor, which of course is what then processes through to the cochlear implant. And finally, as another sidebar, the mechanical engineering technology incorporated in the implant design, it drew from the fine machining skills developed in the automotive manufacturing industry in Australia. So what are the lessons for innovation in Australia? The first is time. It took 10 years of research before there was a working prototype, and a further 10 years of technology translation, regulatory submissions before full commercialisation was possible. Research excellence. The quality and rigour of the scientific research undertaken by the team at the University of Melbourne was world-leading and has continued to underpin Cochlear's commercial success. It was incredibly good science. Risk sharing. The public interest grant from the government enabled both the continuation of the Melbourne University research and the initial phase of technology translation by Nucleus through its Cochlear division. In short, that grant saved the bionic ear from the valley of death. Then there's industry-government collaboration. Beyond the public interest grant, Paul Traynor strongly believed in collaboration between industry and government, and he fostered a very strong working relationship with John Button, who was Industry Minister from 1983, and with the then Prime Minister, Bob Hawke. And Mrs. Slatyer has just reminded me that Ralph and Bob went to school together. Paul Traynor, and this is something that I only discovered as part of actually preparing for this speech, Paul Traynor was a member of ATSIC, the Australian Science and Technology Council. And I remember preparing board papers with, ATSIC in them. And I was also sent off because of being a junior accountant, to go and do some analysis around, well, what would happen if we could deduct more than 100% of our R&D expenditure? Now remember, this is Nucleus that had no cash, so anything that might help the cash flow. So did that work. What I didn't know until preparing for this speech, that it was Ralph, who was chair of ATSIC at the time, And Ralph and Paul together took the proposal to the Prime Minister, to Bob Hawke, for the 150% R&D concession. And that became policy in 1985 and was world-leading at the time. So Paul and Ralph were clearly partners in crime. Next lesson is policy consistency. The commitment to a grant structured over 5 years and which remained in place through a change of government. The CRC program, which has now been in place for 33 years, and the R&D tax incentive in place for nearly 40 years. Now, the CRC program and the RDTI policies have necessarily been changed and adapted over time, but their core purpose remains, and that's incredible consistency. Then there's the ecosystem strength and depth. Cochlear's ability to draw on Australia's long-standing capability in audiology enabled it to undertake faster iteration of its product design and functionality, and therefore speed to market. And then on the market side, Cochlear was born global, building on the market survey enabled to the public interest grant process. And technology. Cochlear is a quintessential example of a technology integrator. It took the University of Melbourne science, translating it into a product which could be commercialised through drawing on technologies from within Nucleus, particularly the Telectronics pacemaker division. There's a very good reason that the earlier cochlear implants looked like Telectronics pacemakers. It got its IC design and fab from Switzerland, lead design and speech processing functionality through the CRC, and had over 30 nationalities represented in its workforce in Australia alone, many of whom brought with them incredible skills in mechanical, software and electrical engineering. Then there are people. The role of champions, people like Graham Clark, Ian McPhee, Ralph Tobias, Paul Traynor, John Button and Ralph Slatyer, whose understanding of the system and their purposeful actions have had a profound and continuing impact on innovation in Australia. So back to the question of Cochlear's success. As the above 9 lessons highlight, it was the fortuitous conjunction of multiple interdependent elements of the innovation system which enabled Cochlear to survive and grow, and the role of thoughtful, timely and purposeful government policy was absolutely pivotal. So, to my 3 challenges and their cautionary notes. So, Cochlear's success should be much celebrated. But the first of my caution, there is a distinction between translation and commercialisation. There is a continuum, but there is still a distinction. These 2 terms are often used interchangeably and yet could not represent more different phases. And at the risk of generalising to make the point, commercialisation occurs when a viable product or service is taken to market. And in TRL terms, you could say that occurs at TRL 7 to 9. There are customers willing to pay for it, value is created, and at that point, we have innovation. Translation, on the other hand, is the phase before commercialisation. It involves validating an experimental proof of concept, prototyping, then demonstrating in an operational environment that there is a viable product or service. In TRL terms, it occurs at TRL 4 to 6. In Cochlear, it was the translation phase that was covered by the public interest grant, whereby the University of Melbourne experimental prototype technology was evolved into a viable implant ready to undergo human clinical trials and become commercialised. I would argue strongly that Australia's performance in commercialisation is good, and it's certainly comparable to other similar economies. Where we falter, as we've heard in many instances this morning, is during translation, which is why it is so important from a policy perspective to distinguish between the 2 phases, because the policy responses to enable translation are very different. As we've heard in previous sessions, there's a crucial role for research infrastructure, for CRCs, co-location and precincts, and they all play a role in fostering an environment conducive to translation. My second challenge and caution is the national interest. In Cochlear's case, the government determined that it was in the national interest to share the risk of the translation phase with Nucleus. as its ultimate commercialisation partner. The IP was retained in Australia, as was the manufacturing base, because of the conditionality under the terms of the grant. Australia has benefited through jobs created, royalties received, and taxes paid. Most people in this room will have benefited from the Cochlear dividends paid into their superannuation funds. There is a strong case for such government risk sharing via non-dilutive grants in instances where valuable IP, developed with the support of public money, which is a point we have to remember, and where Australia has a comparative advantage. This is particularly important for IP in sectors which are just emerging, such as space. We heard about the clean tech instance this morning with MCI Carbon, and quantum computing, in which Australia has world-leading IP and capability, but which is being coveted by other countries as we speak. And shame on us if we lose it. The Minister's announcement this morning of the Industry Growth Programme is very welcome in this regard, because even to the extent that venture funding is available for early stage translation, the dilution through low valuations and subsequent funding rounds means that control and the IP passes to the venture capitalists, who often represent offshore interests given the size of the funding cheques that need to be written. We're seeing this currently with IPO markets closed and very low valuations for early stage technology businesses. The choice facing these businesses is to shut down or accept the dilution and loss of control over the IP. And again, I think Sophia made this point this morning. This is not a question of Fortress Australia or protectionism, but rather of achieving a return on the public money which has been invested in supporting research and its translation. So, for example, there could possibly be more emphasis on the I in FIRB through conditionality in approvals to ensure a level of continuing investment in Australia, particularly in those sectors which play to Australia's strength as a technology integrator. And again this morning, Matthew Wilson's point about government being a demanding customer, the first customer, there is a real role for government in that regard, again to provide revenue on the demand side, which would enable these companies to survive a bit longer and not need to go to that very dilutive venture funding. We need to acknowledge that the innovation system is actually global, and it will not be optimising for Australia's national interest. Deft and well-designed policy responses are required to ensure that Australia continues to leverage its comparative advantage within this global system. We have done so with consistent investment in resources, health, and the ag sectors, for example, all of which demonstrated high levels of innovation and global competitiveness. Strong as these sectors are, however, there is broad agreement we must diversify the economy. This will require conviction and consistent policy, not the chop and change that we've experienced. Unfortunately, the last 10 years has seen constant policy change. So, for example, we had growth precincts, which were rebadged after a 2-year interregnum to industry growth centres, which were then defunded in favour of modern manufacturing initiatives, which has now been replaced by the National Reconstruction Fund. Unsurprisingly, a close look at these programs reveals a broad consensus on priority areas of comparative advantage, but the constant change of policy architecture has eroded the benefit of any focus. Which leads to the final caution, and this is the failure of consistency of policy. Policy consistency and investment over time are essential, given the long cycle times inherent in innovation. However, a retrospective study undertaken about 7 years ago found that the average duration of innovation policies in Australia was approximately 2.5 years. This has not improved in the years since. A major contributor, of course, is our short electoral cycle, which as a minimum results in ministerial changes, and when there's also a change of government, inconsequential machinery of government changes. Such changes often lead to the suspension of existing policies, an interregnum measured in years before new policies are in place, existing networks and linkages are interrupted and broken, and valuable time is lost in building new relationships with those in government. And finally, and crucially, the basis on which previous long-term research and investment decisions were made may be undermined. So without wanting to be too unkind, it often feels as though the system has memory, but the policy sector has amnesia. This level of change militates against innovation, subjecting the system to a high level of disturbance and uncertainty. We can't change our electoral cycle, but we can seek to minimise this damaging disturbance through a better understanding of the impacts of the changes. And perhaps one suggestion would be to conduct an innovation system impact statement when implementing or discontinuing any innovation policy initiatives. This would drive a better understanding of system dependencies and lead to a conscious focus on design for policy effectiveness. So Ralph Slatyer understood the power of well-functioning systems and their vulnerability. He understood the importance of taking action to promote their health and productivity and their fragility when exposed to disturbance. Cochlear was the outcome of an innovation system which was well-functioning because of decisions made over decades, linkages made and risks taken at crucial moments, consistent policy and investment, and collaboration across business, government, and academia. So to answer the original question of why don't we have more successes like Cochlear, this is what it will take for Australia to have more of those successes. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, for that wonderful Ralph Slatyer address. It was really interesting to hear the detail of the story behind Cochlear, and I think there was a really good summary of some of the challenges and opportunities that we're facing as Australia's innovation ecosystem. It'll be really interesting to pick those up in the conversations we have for the rest of the afternoon. We're going to do a short break, just 10 minutes. We'll resume session 3 next at 1:30. So 10-minute break, see you again at 1:30.